Between 1450 and 1750, Europe burned alive between 40,000 and 60,000 people. 80% of them were women. Their crime? Witchcraft. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Most weren't witches. They were healers, midwives, women who owned property, women who refused to marry, women who were too old, too poor, or too independent. The witch hunts weren't about magic. They were about control. And the methods used to convict them? They were designed so that no woman could survive. This is the truth about the women burned alive, and why their screams still echo through history. Let's destroy the first myth. Witches weren't devil-worshipping crones flying on broomsticks. The women accused of witchcraft were ordinary people, but they shared specific characteristics that made them targets: the healers and midwives. In medieval Europe, most healthcare happened in homes, not hospitals. Women who knew herbal medicine, how to ease pain during childbirth, how to prevent infection, how to induce abortion, these women had power, and the church noticed. When a midwife's remedies worked, she was blessed. When a baby died during birth, she was a witch who murdered it with dark magic. The independent women, widows who inherited property, women who refused to remarry, unmarried women who lived alone. In a society where women were supposed to be controlled by fathers, then husbands, then sons, an independent woman was an anomaly, a threat. The poor and elderly, old women who begged for food. If you refused them, and then your cow died or your child got sick, the old woman had cursed you. Poverty became evidence of witchcraft. The outcasts, women with physical deformities, women with mental illness, women who were too beautiful, too ugly, too outspoken, too quiet. In Germany, they burned a 7-year-old girl. In Scotland, they executed a woman because her daughter had a seizure. In Salem, Massachusetts, they hanged women because teenage girls had hysterical fits. The truth is simple and horrifying. Any woman could be accused, and once accused, there was almost no way to prove your innocence. Welcome to the Shadow Archives. I'm your guide through the forbidden histories they don't want you to remember. If you want the full truth, subscribe now, because this story gets darker. So were any of them actually practicing witchcraft? Yes, but not the kind you think. What the church called witchcraft was actually folk magic, practices that had existed for thousands of years, long before Christianity arrived. Herbal medicine. Women brewed teas from willow bark for pain. What we now know contains salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin. They used ergot fungus to speed up labor, dangerous but sometimes effective. Foxglove for heart problems, mugwort for digestion, belladonna for inflammation. This wasn't magic, it was early medicine, but the church saw it as competition. Why pray to God for healing when the village woman could cure you with plants? Charms and spells. Women created protective amulets. They whispered prayers over sick children, often Christian prayers mixed with older pagan words. They practiced love magic, herbs under pillows, tokens buried at crossroads, rituals performed during full moons. Was it effective? Probably not. But it gave people a sense of control in a world of plague, famine, and constant death. Midwifery. This was the most dangerous skill of all. Midwives controlled birth, the most mysterious, powerful, and deadly moment in medieval life. When births went wrong, someone had to be blamed, and that someone was usually the midwife. The church even claimed midwives killed babies to use their fat in flying ointments, a completely fabricated accusation that appears in the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the manual used to hunt and prosecute witches. Real paganism. Some women did practice remnants of pre-Christian religions, celebrating solstices, leaving offerings for nature spirits, honoring the old gods in secret. But this wasn't Satanism. There was no devil worship. That was a Christian invention. The devil, as the church described him, didn't exist in pagan traditions. So when inquisitors tortured women into confessing they'd made pacts with Satan, they were confessing to something that had been imagined for them. Here's the reality. These women were practicing folk medicine, midwifery, and ancient traditions. The church called it witchcraft. And for that, They burned. So why did this happen? Why did Europe decide to burn tens of thousands of women? The answer is power, control, and a perfect storm of social panic. 1. The church needed an enemy, 1400s to 1500s. After the Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe, people were terrified. They needed someone to blame. The church provided an answer: witches. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull declaring witchcraft a real and dangerous heresy. 2 years later, 2 Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the Malleus Maleficarum. This book was a manual for witch hunting. It explained how to identify a witch, how to interrogate her, how to torture her until she confessed, how to execute her. And it was explicitly misogynistic. It claimed women were more susceptible to demonic influence because they were weaker in faith and more carnal than men. The Malleus became a bestseller, second only to the Bible. 2. The Reformation created chaos, 15th to 16th centuries. When Martin Luther split Christianity, Catholics and Protestants both needed to prove they were the true faith, and both sides agreed on one thing: witches were real and they had to be destroyed. Germany, caught between Catholic and Protestant territories, burned more witches than any other country. 3. Economic and social pressure. Witch hunts spiked during times of famine, plague, and economic collapse. When crops failed, someone was blamed. When children died, someone was blamed. And that someone was almost always a woman on the margins of society, someone without a powerful husband or family to defend her. Accusing someone of witchcraft also had financial benefits. In many regions, the accuser could seize the witch's property after execution. Old widow with a cottage and a cow? Accuse her of witchcraft. Once she's burned, her property is yours. 4. Mass hysteria. Witch hunts were contagious. Once accusations started, they spread. One woman, under torture, would name others. Those women would name more. In the German town of Bamberg, the witch trials spiraled so out of control that the prince bishop himself was eventually accused. In Würzburg, 900 people were executed in a single wave of hysteria. The witch hunts weren't about justice. They were about fear, power, and the systematic destruction of women who didn't fit the mold. And the methods they used to convict them? They were designed to ensure no one escaped. The witch trials were rigged from the start. Once you were accused, you were guilty. The trial was just a formality before your execution. Here's how it worked. The accusation. Anyone could accuse anyone, a neighbor, a rival, a jealous spouse. No evidence was required. Suspicion was enough. The tests. To prove you were a witch, they used tests, all of them impossible to pass. The swimming test. They tied your hands and feet and threw you into a river. If you floated, you were a witch, because water, being pure, rejected evil. If you sank and drowned, you were innocent. Either way, you died. The pricking test. Witch hunters believed witches had a devil's mark, a spot on their body where they felt no pain, so they stripped you naked and stabbed you repeatedly with needles. If you didn't react, because of shock, because the needle hit scar tissue, because you were numb with terror, you were a witch. If you screamed, they kept stabbing until they found a spot where you didn't. The torture. If the tests weren't enough, they tortured you. Thumbscrews, the rack, the strappado, where they hung you by your wrists tied behind your back, dislocating your shoulders. Sleep deprivation, starvation, whipping. They tortured you until you confessed. And the confession always included the same details: making a pact with the devil, attending a witch's Sabbath, cursing your neighbors, killing children. They fed you the answers. You just had to repeat them. And once you confessed, they made you name other witches. Under agony, you'd name anyone, your friends, your family, anyone, to make the pain stop. The execution. In most of Europe, witches were burned alive. In England and the American colonies, they were hanged. In Scotland, they were strangled first, then burned. Some were beheaded before burning, a mercy if you could call it that. But many were burned alive, tied to a wooden stake. surrounded by bundled wood as a crowd watched. Priests offered last rites, executioners lit the fire, and the accused, often a grandmother, a healer, a woman who just wanted to live her life, died screaming. The last execution for witchcraft in Europe was in 1782. In Switzerland, a woman named Anna Goldi, she was accused of bewitching a child. They tortured her until she confessed. Then they beheaded her. Her name is now on a memorial, an apology that came 226 years too late. The witch hunts were never about magic. They were about power. And the women who died weren't witches. They were women who knew too much, who owned too much, who refused too much. They were women who didn't bow. And for that, they burned. But here's the thing about fire. It destroys, but it also illuminates. The witch hunts are over. But the fight for the right to exist freely, independently, and without fear, that fight is still burning. If you want more hidden histories, subscribe and hit the bell. Drop a comment. Were the witch hunts about magic or control? I'll see you in the next one.